it's sort of going chaotic the day after April Fool's. It's an exciting moment for me, as I'm sure you also are. Very excited to start with very shiny copy of David Hackett Fischer's Albion Seed for British Folkways in America. I really am excited to start reading from this. This is a fantastic early exploration of early American history through the 4 waves of migration. The one we'll talk about today is of Quaker migration to the Delaware Valley and uncovering what it was they were. So with this black wax hand and this orange wax pear, we are summoning up, boys and girls, and let's get started with David Hackett Fischer and the peculiar early Quakers, who for us friends are very inspiring people, and we need a little bit of their grit and their passion, or a lot of it nowadays. None of this boring modern complacency or laziness or spiritual apathy. Take that kind of fervour, but also maybe place it in the framework of today, because what the early Quakers did with their clothes was really quite peculiar. So what did they wear? It's interesting what they didn't wear and all the rules that were applied to it. Women were given far more rules, it appeared, than men. Even in a very egalitarian society, this was the way of life. So the book uncovers the various folkways, the streams of life of people, the way they played sport, what they ate, how they dealt with the dead and their own deaths. So we've got the clothing ways, the dress ways, the Delaware dress ways. My previous reading on the clothes of fools and jesters in the English court, that was rather stuttered and unprepared. So hopefully this one will go a little bit better. The calico, oh the calico, wrote Anne Cooper in 1762. I think tobacco and tea and calico may all be set down with the keeping of Negroes, all one as bad as another. So for pretty much all of early friends, slavery was very much frowned upon, although some early friends did, of course, keep slaves, and using the language of the time, it was the word Negro, and that was definitely becoming less and less acceptable. Just as wearing calico and of smoking tobacco and drinking tea. Pretty extreme. Remembering the Quakers emphasised that they were a Puritan set. David Hackett Fischer is really trying to unravel what that word Puritan really, really meant. It wasn't always a bad thing. To strangers, the cultural values of the Quakers were most visible in these distinctive attitudes towards dress, which became a vital part of Quaker identity and an important expression of their faith. I should emphasise today, a lot of Quakers just dress, how they feel. All right, and even some friends in this time, the 1600s, they did also. They were free. They wore what they liked, but generally speaking, no, they had particular rules. The idea of going plain in the world, a classic Quaker phrase, made its appearance during the first period of Quakerism as part of George Fox's gospel. George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, his followers took up this teaching with high enthusiasm. In many a North Midland town, the visit of a Quaker evangelist was followed by an event called the burning of the Braveries, in which the people made a bonfire of their ribbons and silks. During the second period of Quakerism, the Society of Friends developed George Fox's taste for simple clothing into dress codes of fantastic complexity. Quakers believed that clothing in all its forms was an emblem of Adam's fall. A badge of lost innocence. There is really peculiar things going on in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, where Adam hears the sound of God. I think this is how it happens because they eat from the tree of knowledge. Adam hears the sound of God, and then he covers his shame. He feels ashamed to be naked before God. God later gives them clothing, but shame enters here. And there's a lot of discussion of what shame is and how it comes into the shame. Differentiated from humiliation. Humiliation is being ashamed about or humiliated about something external. Shame is deep sensitivity about yourself, about who you are. William Penn of Pennsylvania, famous Quaker, argued that guilt brought shame, and shame an apron and a coat. As sin, and this is quoting from William Penn in No Cross, No Crown. This basically sounds like Christian anarchism, right? No cross, no crown. Quoting William Penn, as sin brought the first coat. It really does in the Old Testament. The first sin, and then the shame, and then the clothing. As sin brought the first coat, poor Adam's offspring have little reason to be proud or curious of their clothes, for it seems their original was base, and the finery of them will neither make them noble nor man innocent again. Our first parents were then naked and knew no shame, but sin made them ashamed to be no longer naked. It explicitly states Adam and Eve were not ashamed to be naked prior to their eating of the tree of knowledge. Since therefore guilt brought shame, and shame an apron and a coat, how low are they fallen that glory in their shame, and that are proud of their fall. For so they are that use care and cost to trim, and set off the very badge and livery of that lamentable lapse. If a thief were to wear chains all his life, would their being gold and well made abate their infamy? To be sure, his being choice of them would increase it. This idea was reinforced by another principle. Quakers believed that clothing should be only what was needful to cover their shame and fence out the cold. Every ornament not needful was systematically searched out and condemned. Quakers generally agreed that excessive dress was unscriptural. Another quote from Penn: how many pieces of ribbon, feathers, lace bands, and the like had Adam and Eve in paradise or out of it? I think the black hand has fallen. It's taken a dive. What rich embroideries, silks, points, etc. had Abel, Enoch, Noah, and good old Abraham? Did Eve, Sarah, Susanna, Elizabeth, and the Virgin Mary use curl, powder, patch, paint, wear false locks of strange colours, rich points, trimmings, laced gowns, embroidered petticoats, shows in slip-slaps, laced with silk or silver lace and ruffled like pigeons' feet? Did they? William Penn asks, of Pennsylvania. To all of these reasons for going plain, Quakers added yet another argument, that a primary purpose of fashion was to arouse the sexual passions which they feared and despised. This being a classic Puritan sect, of course. It's notorious, Penn wrote, how many fashions have been and are invented on purpose to excite to lust, which enslaves their minds to shameful concupiscence. As if these objections were not enough, Quakers added the argument that costly costumes created envy in the world and divided one friend from another. This is entirely to do with money and socioeconomics. They believed, in company with others of their age, that the stock of wealth was fixed. There's only so much money in the world, and we all deserve a share in it, and that one person's extravagance caused the impoverishment of another. If thou art clean and warm, it is sufficient, wrote Penn, for more doth rob the poor. So simply owning something rich livery and a fine apron, that would dispossess the disadvantaged. Further, Quakers argued that attention to superficial things diminished a deeper concern for the life within. Isaac Norris of Philadelphia in 1719 instructed to his son in London, "Come back plain. This will be a reputation to thee, and recommended thee to the best and most sensible people. I always suspect the furniture of the inside where too much application is shown for a gay or fantastical outside." There's a beautiful sentence, a beautiful image. The furniture of the inside, that's what counts, that's what matters. Bizarrely, though, the restrictions of what you saw on the outside became themselves a kind of Quaker fetish, this obsession with appearances, which is exactly what they were trying not to do. It's all about the flame burning within you. Moreover, it was important to Quakers that they should simply be different from others in the world. In 1726, the female Friends of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting drafted an open letter to all women of their persuasion, condemning vain conversations, customs, and fashions in the world. Dear sisters, they wrote, these things we solidly recommend to your care and notice, that we might be unto the Lord a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people. They wanted to be a peculiar people. Peculiar had different meanings at the time. I think it might have meant elect or chosen. Simply put, a fantastic beer is called the Old Peculiar from some North Yorkshire brewery. And it's to do with some particular church title. I obviously drunk too much of it to remember. When Quakers translated their ideal of going plain into actuality, they adopted a special form of simple dress which derived from the folk costume of England's North Midlands. George Fox himself wore the costume of a North Country shoemaker. North Country being, I don't know, present-day Durham, I think, in England, or just north of something. Okay, I'm from Oxford, what do I know? Of a North Country shoemaker. This is George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, including heavy leather breeches and a doublet of distinctive cut, which became a symbol of both the man and his movement. Fox was called the man in the leather breeches. With my long leather breeches and my father, I am walking in the light of the Lord, said Fox, as I've beautifully replicated that old Quaker song. Yes. And was thought to wear them all the time, his breeches, except only a little during one hot summer, in his own words. So this is pretty strict of George Fox. It's comparable to how monks wear the same thing all the time, and nuns, of course. This outer purity reflecting inner purity, I guess. George Fox's costume was widely imitated by other male Quakers for many years. Ancient leather breeches were handed down from father to son. A Yorkshire friend and when I say friend, of course, the Quakers were a society of friends with capital F. So when I say friend, I mean Quaker. A Yorkshire friend in the 19th century recalled, when I was a lad, there was a vast many still sitting in their father's leather breeches, and more than one I knew, had breeks their grandfathers had for their best, and there was a vast of good wear in 'em yet. Other humble people in the North Midlands wore simple trousers of a broad cut, with a wide leather apron in front. The costume was brought to the Delaware Valley and was worn by farmers for many years. A European visitor found Quaker farmer John Bartram dressed in white trousers and a large leather apron. Must have looked very, very fetching, a leather apron. The conventional costume of male Quakers also derived in other ways from the dress of farmers and artisans in the north of England. It's just struck me that you can be costumed, right? Your daily routine is your clothes, your costume. I say that in Portuguese, acostumar. If you're used to doing something, não estou acostumado a fazer isso, I'm not used to doing this. And then also you've got the priestly language of habit. Habit was the word for vestments that priests would wear. He's in his habit. And of course now habit means your daily routine. The common fabric of the north was a plain homespun called hodden grey. One variety called Penistone was, of course, woolen fabric named after the village in Yorkshire. In the Delaware Valley, Penistone was one of the first textiles to be manufactured on a large scale. Its soft grey colour set the tone for Quaker clothing through generations. So normal did this costume seem that when Mary Pennington had a vision of Jesus, the Saviour appeared before her as a fresh, lovely youth, clad in grey cloth, very plain and neat. How did the English make their money in the early Industrial Revolution? Of course, it's fabrics and textiles. That's the earliest boom of the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the spinning jenny and the jacquard machine. It's all about fabrics, textiles. That's what launches what we now know is capitalism. It's all about clothes and showing off. That's what the Quakers were rejecting. And they rejected, of course, the capitalist ideals as well. Merely owning rich clothes would be a demonstration of the disruption of egalitarian economic ideals, so to speak. Quaker meetings in England and America enforced the rule of simplicity in dress with regulations of high complexity. The Pennsylvania Council entertained a proposal for restricting all men to only two sorts of dress through the year. Can you imagine that? Only wearing two kinds of clothes throughout the whole year. Must have been great fun. Male friends were forbidden to wear cross pockets on their coats and needless pockets of any sort. How dare you walk down the main road of our village with your disgusting pockets? They were warned against broad hems, deep cuffs, false shoulders, oh my, superfluous buttons. Filthy, coming in here with his extra buttons and his long sleeves, how dare he? Fashionable creases, wide skirts and cocked hats. The refusal of Quakers to use tricks of tailoring created a garment of curious profile called the shad belly coat in the Delaware Valley. The question of male headgear was much debated among Quakers. Men were encouraged to wear plain broad-brimmed beaver hats, undyed and uncocked. I'm resisting the temptation there. A beaver hat that is uncocked. Fantastic. So many adopted this fashion that American Quakers in the early 18th century were called broad brims, or men with broad hats and no pockets. Many meetings also wrestled with the difficult question of wigs. The difficult question of wigs, yes, plaguing the communities, keeping the men up at night. What do I do about the wig? Wigs were a big deal. You see many depictions of court life, say, I don't know, 18th, 19th century England. They're all wearing these horrible wigs, which must have stunk and been really, really annoying to wear. Hairless friends were permitted to wear modest periwigs, but only after they had consulted with elders and solemnly affirmed that necessity and not voluptuousness had brought them to the use of them. End quote. Even if these needful wigs were expected to be such as in colour and shape resemble their former hair as need be, and were not to be excessively long, full, bushy, proud or powdered, Quakers who kept their own hair were generally discouraged from wearing any wigs at all. For women, even more elaborate dress codes were recommended. So here's the contradiction right there. Quakerism, on any relative scale, was very much more emancipated in terms of women's rights. Yet some unconscious rules slip through the net, and of course we get more and heavy expectations loaded upon the shoulders of our plainly dressed or otherwise Quaker female friends. The women's meetings discussed at length every imaginable aspect of feminine costume. Fashionable hairstyles and fancy hats were condemned. Women of all ages were encouraged to wear plain hoods, which in the 18th century were replaced by bonnets of extreme severity. Handkerchiefs were worn modestly over the top of the bodice. Quaker women were expected to wear aprons when they appeared in public, either of green or blue or other grave colours, and not white, nor any silk aprons. Dresses were to be of simple cut and plain colours. Special warnings were issued against the wearing of stripped or branched stuff or silk, or long scarves, or any other things which may lead us into the fashions of the world. In the 18th century, Quakers discouraged the use of dyes, particularly indigo, because it was produced by slave labour. Bright dyes were condemned as excessively proud, and dark dyes were forbidden because they were thought to hide dirt. That's fascinating, isn't it, in terms of the Quaker ideology? You're not allowed to wear even darker colours because they will hide your dirt. They'll hide your shame. If you're wearing dark, the presumption is you have something to hide. On the other hand, it's quite a beautiful image that they all walked around in communities with not their hearts on their sleeves, their short sleeves, but this idea of we've got nothing to hide. We're here. We're not pretending, hopefully not pretending purity, but showing, if we have it, our sin to be raised in the meetings for worship. That's the good line. The bad line is we'll just wear this pure clothes and they will somehow make us pure. We won't have to worry about it. There's a fascinating Hasidic tale related to this, which I would be able to recount, but my mum is going to send me the book at some point, along with a whole stack of other things. And it's thanks to my wonderful mum that I've got this book here in the first place. It cost an arm and a leg to send this here to Lisbon. So thanks for that. She's had to remortgage the house because of this. So thank you. Excuse me, sorry, I lost my place. Dresses were to be of simple cut and plain colours. Special warnings were issued against the wearing of striped or branched stuff or silk, or long scarves, or any other things which may lead us into the fashions of the world. I think I already read that. In the 18th century, yes, excuse me, I did already read that. Dyes came on to the subject of dyes. The Quakers didn't wear them because they were produced by the slave market, I'm guessing in the South. I don't know anything about this, but that's quite interesting. Dark dyes were forbidden because they were thought to hide dirt. The New Jersey Quaker John Woolman, fascinating guy, literally called the Wool Man, conducted a lifelong campaign against the use of dyestuffs on this ground, and we're quoting from John Woolman's book here, the Woolman Journal. I have been where much cloth hath been dyed, he wrote in his journal, and have at sundry times walked over the ground where much of their dyestuffs has drained away. This hath produced a longing in my mind that might come into cleanness of spirit, cleanness of person, and cleanness about the house and garments. Real cleanliness becometh a holy people. But hiding that which is not clean by colouring our garments seems contrary to the sweetness of sincerity. Through some sorts of dyes, cloth is rendered less useful. And if the value of dyestuffs and expense of dyeing and the damage done to cloth were all added together, and that cost applied to keeping all sweet and clean, how much more would real cleanliness prevail? I'm going to show you some rather catching Quaker dress here in my really crappy camera. So that's what women were supposed to wear. There is a real beauty, though, in this simplicity. Think of the old masters, the Dutch masters, there still lies in the purity of everyday domestic life. What is it? The phrase godliness is cleanliness, something like this. The Quaker dress I've just shown you was made in the mid-18th century and still survives in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, of course, meaning the land of brotherly love, fraternal love. It had no buttons, oh no, belt, sash, decorations, or adornments of any kind, no, out. But it was designed with grace and refinement and cut from fine silk. The dress was worn with a handkerchief folded modestly over the bodice in accordance with the recommendation of many women's meetings. So they really had to come to a corporate decision to make these fashion styles. It wasn't sort of one person doing it. That's of course part of the corporate nature of Quaker life. And unless I'm mistaken, corporate comes from the word body, corpus, whatever, corpo in Portuguese. And so what I'm trying to say, this is made more or less unanimously, at least with what they consider to be the leadings of light within each of them. And there's really, for me, fascinating symbolic relation going on here. Let me just read again. This Quaker dress had no buttons, belt, sash, decorations, or adornments of any kind. Grace and refinement, fine silk. And especially if you cast this in relation to what fools and jesters were supposed to wear, what we think they wore. When you do a little bit of research around this, you come across so many little things, small things, related terms, related words, bric-a-brac, these small objects of art that were found in people's cupboards across Europe. Bric-a-brac comes from a French nonsense phrase meaning this and that. I don't know, a bric, a brac, whatever. Then you come across curios, small, curious items, bells and whistles, ribbons. The image of Quakers bringing their ribbons and sashes to bonfires and getting rid of all of this smallness. When you call someone petty, for example, someone is being petty, being small-minded, being really minimal, being focused in these fussy, needless things. Petty means small, from petit in French. So I'm very, very curious about how the Quakers seem to want to sort of spread the light into wider things. And symbolically, that's the removal of all of these tiny items. So yes, bric-a-brac, jewellery, of course. Jewellery is highly symbolic part of clothing, usually without any kind of pragmatic use or utilitarian purpose. Jewelry is often used for social designation, demonstrating your place in society. Also could be used as an amulet, as a kind of charm. And Quakers absolutely had nothing to do with it. They eradicated all of this to furnish the interior, so to speak. You can think of clothing as a kind of furniture of the body. The body is God's temple. So, neatness, to continue with the wonderful David Hackett Fischer. Neatness and cleanliness were also encouraged in other ways. Amelia Gummier remembered that friends were, quote, as notable for the neatness as for the old-fashioned cut of their garments. Their linen was always fine and clean. End quote. Quakers were also forbidden to have commerce in clothing that was denied to them. This was the case in both England and in America. The Cheshire Quarterly Meeting as early as 1699 agreed to the very strict rules in that respect. Bringing to mind the quite strange situation of this sounds really, really judgmental, but I'm curious about the rulemaking behind a Muslim selling alcohol, as I do see it's a common thing. And maybe the need to make an income for your family overrides the prohibition of alcohol. And whether the prohibition of alcohol in Islam extends to even selling it, I'm not sure. Certainly, alcohol is still made in certain Muslim communities. Brandy is allowed to be drunk at times of extremity, where you're near the end of your life, according to certain traditions in Islam. But Quakers were forbidden from even selling prohibited clothing. To quote the Cheshire Quarterly Meeting, and that must be Cheshire in England, of 1699, a question having been proposed to this meeting, whether any friend may make, sell, or buy anything which it is not consistent with truth, or that friends cannot wear, which matter came to this result: that the making, buying, or selling striped, figure, printed silks, stuffs, or cloths, or anything else that friends cannot wear, is altogether inconsistent with truth, and for future to be avoided. Liberty being only given that such as have any such by them do dispose thereof, and for the future buy no more. Not the most elegant writing in Quaker literature, but you get the point. The selling, even the mere trade of these so-called needless clothing items, the trade was, to use that phrase, inconsistent with truth, which is a very mild way of saying not allowed. Remember, Quakers don't have doctrine. They don't have thou shalt not. It simply was not even prohibited. I shouldn't maybe use that word, but it was strongly advised against. Whether that really matters in practice, because you would have been ostracized and very rarely, excommunicated isn't the word, because there was no church. There was just meeting houses, but banished, probably not the right word as well, but yeah, pushed out of the community, possibly. That did happen in the early Quaker settlements, but suffice to say, it wasn't thou shalt or you shall not. It is a sin. It is if you do this, it is inconsistent with the truth. The famous encounter of George Fox, I think it was with William Penn or some other early Quaker witches. George Fox sees the early friend with a sword in his breeches or whatever. It's probably, I have to research this, but this is basically the story. George Fox encounters the friend, sees him with a weapon. Quakers being pacifists, full-on pacifists. George Fox says, so what about that sword? And the friend says, well, I must wear it. I need it. And George Fox, instead of saying, get rid of it, along with your wig, George Fox says, wear that sword as long as thou canst, as long as you can. Which is a way of introducing a little worm of guilt, maybe, into the friend's head, saying, wear it as long as you can get away with from your own conscience. If your conscience starts running, it will naturally be a consequence that you can't wear that sword and call yourself a Quaker. Quakers don't have doctrine. They do have walls. They do have boundaries. You can't just turn up and do anything. There are some things that tie friends together, and they are implicit rules, maybe. Quaker hostility to changing fashion caused them to cling to clothing styles of the past. Hostility to changing fashion. Great writing. Amelia Gummere wrote, what a name as well. Amelia Gummere. This is just a joy, this book, the whole thing. And remember, this book isn't just about Quakers, it's about 3 other kinds of migration, but we don't have time to go into that. Amelia Gummere wrote that it may be set down as a safe rule in seeking for a Quaker style or custom at any given time to take the worldly fashion or habit of the period preceding. Again, implication is there's a fetishizing of the past, which itself is an obsession with appearances, which goes against Quaker teaching. So that's why I turn up to meeting in a dressing gown and beautiful 6-inch heels. Always some rebelled against these rules. A few restless souls called gay Quakers wore whatever pleased them with their beaver hats beaver hats with uncocked brims. But most friends, they would have been cocked brims actually. That would be the elaborate thing to do. So cocked being like little turn at the edge of the hat. But most friends, even the most affluent, attempted to preserve something of going plain into the world. One who allowed himself the luxury of silver buttons, this is too good. One who allowed himself the luxury of silver buttons insisted that they should not be wrought or engraved. In 1724, a German printer noted that affluent Quakers in Pennsylvania wore plain clothing, except that the material is very costly or even is velvet. Plain did not mean cheap. Many Quakers, including William Penn himself, combined exceptionally refined taste with the plain style and were willing to spend large sums of clothing of good quality. Spend large sums for clothing of good quality. Quaker dressways were invented in the North Midlands of England. But they survived longer in the New World than the Old, and became more uniform in the Delaware Valley than they had been in any part of Britain. This is the really fascinating thing that happens in America, or the New World. Old English styles are preserved. They're fossilized, they're concretized. Whereas England continues with its own traditions and moves on and loses, for example, thee and thou, the informal you, that's lost. Ye kind of goes unless you're from the West Country, I believe, near Bristol. America, happening to be more isolated, keeps these old traditions. Naming traditions, clothing traditions, as it is in this case. So counterexample is the early Americans in, say, Missouri, Texas, you know what I mean, there's southern states, which even today, I believe you can still hear the word thee and thou, and definitely in the Northeast, in You know what I'm talking about. Maine, where Stephen King's from, the northeast of the States. You can still hear certain friends say thee and thou. And ye, y'all, you, plural, which we don't have in British English. Never mind other kinds of English. So these old traditions just get stored, and that's why it's really stupid of British people to say American English isn't English. British English is the original. It's like the Catholic idea of Christianity being a perversion, being an obsession, being a fetishization of perceived antiquity, perceived oldness and tradition, when actually it couldn't be further from the case. And here we see travellers from, I think it's from like 1700s, a bit later on, from England and from the continent, who go to America and see, oh my God, it's like being back in earlier England. So don't confuse America with novelty. In fact, they keep these older things. They survived longer, these old dressways of North Midlands, England, they survived longer in the New World than in the Old. So the New World, perversely, but bizarrely, is the New Old World, or the Old New World, the land of opportunity where things get fossilized. I think I've laboured the point long enough. As early as 1770, an English Quaker was startled by the sight of his first American meeting. Quote, such as I had never seen before, so consistent in appearance of dress and uniformity, he wrote. This is from a man called Oxley in Joseph's Offering to His Children. That's the name of the text. He noted that conformity in dress was much stronger among Quakers in America than in England. When Brissot de Warville, another great name, Brissot de Warville, I have no idea who that is, visited Philadelphia yearly meeting in 1788. He also observed that 90% of the Quakers were dressed in plain homespun, home-crafted clothing. As late as 1985, long after Quaker costume was generally abandoned in England, one historian observed that stylized plain dress only lingers now within certain groups of friends in the United States of America. The Quakers were not the only people who adopted the plain style in the Delaware Valley. So the style spreads to other people and other traditions. So there's a religious tradition, the Mennonites, many German pietists. So they were in a more or less similar part of America. I think that there was a much more German presence in what we now call the Midwest. So in, I guess, Ohio, more or less. Many German pietists had similar dress ways. Mennonite men of various sects were required to wear simple clothing, dark clothes, plain suits, and broad-brimmed hats. Another kind of Puritan tradition. The Mennonites and Quakers shared many, many things in common, even to this day. Women were expected to wear modest dresses with an apron. Oh dear. What happened there? We got interrupted. Troubling times with the bandwidth, of course. So a little bit of interim music. And we shall carry on. Just the last bit of this reading. The sounds of Panalak and a friend of mine, Sharif. So we're talking about the breastcloth of the German modest dresses, the Mennonite tradition, the Brusttuch. Brusttuch is the breastcloth that Mennonite men of various sects were required to wear. Folded over the bodice and a little cap on the back of the head. The fabric and plaits of the cap, K-A-P-P, in German, were unique to each little sect and local community. Many Pennsylvania Germans adopted plain clothing of some sort or other, similar in tone and feeling to the costume of English Quakers. During the 18th century, the plain dress of the Quakers was much admired by others. In the year 1784, for example, a Latin adventurer named Francisco de Miranda was travelling through the United States. One Sunday, he amused himself by attending a Quaker meeting and was captivated by women he saw there. Why else go to Quaker meeting? In his journal he wrote, at 3 o'clock went to the temple of the Quakers, in whose company I remained for 2 hours, without anybody speaking a single word. I entertained myself all this time by examining slowly the dress and countenances of the female concourse, and I can assure you with all the ingenuousness that neither more simplicity, cleanliness and taste in the first, nor more natural and simple beauty in the second can be imagined. I am firmly persuaded that the colouring of Rubens and the carnations of Titian can never imitate what nature offers here in the hue and complexion of these simple Quaker women, who have not a grain of powder or drop of oil on their persons. So to close, many Pennsylvanians who were not themselves Quakers or German pietists tended to imitate these dress ways. Benjamin Franklin, an immigrant from Puritan, Massachusetts, adopted the Quakers' idea of going plain and conformed to so many articles of their dress that he was often mistaken for a friend himself. You're Benjamin Franklin. So also did the Presbyterian Benjamin Rush, the freethinker Thomas Paine, and others of various denominations. In more moderate forms, the ideal of simple dress spread westward from the Delaware Valley into the American Midlands, and for many generations became part of the culture of an American region. It has been a delight to embark on the good ship David Hackett Fischer and Albion Sea. Expect more droning boredom from my mouth in the forthcoming days. Very excited to keep reading from this. So keep yourselves jolly, keep yourselves playing, and I shall be in touch soon.